Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The transition from the scorched earth and skeletal remains of the European theater to the untouched, vibrant, and overwhelmingly productive landscape of the United States represented perhaps the most profound psychological shock experienced by German prisoners of war during the Second World War. For many of these men, particularly those captured in the early waves such as the Afrika Korps in 1943 or the survivors of the Normandy breakout in 1944, the journey to the American heartland was not merely a relocation to a place of internment but a systematic deconstruction of the ideological and strategic foundations upon which their worldview had been built. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels had for years painted a picture of an America that was culturally bankrupt, racially divided, and militarily incapable of standing against the disciplined might of the Third Reich. However, as these soldiers crossed the Atlantic and stepped onto American soil, they were confronted with a reality that proved the German war effort was not only failing but was fundamentally outclassed by an industrial titan that had barely begun to exert its full strength. This realization began the moment they caught sight of the American coastline and only intensified as they were transported across thousands of miles of unbombed, prosperous territory, witnessing a level of logistical and industrial sophistication that made the eventual Allied victory seem not just likely, but inevitable. The first stage of this awakening occurred during the Atlantic crossing. Many German soldiers had been told that the U-boat wolf packs had successfully severed the Allied lifeline, that the Atlantic was a graveyard for American shipping, and that the United States was a besieged island. Yet, as they were transported westward, often in the very Liberty ships they had been told were being sunk by the hundreds, the prisoners observed vast convoys of hundreds of vessels stretching to the horizon. The sheer scale of the merchant marine and the lack of apparent fear from their captors regarding the submarine threat were the first cracks in the facade of German propaganda. Upon approaching the eastern seaboard, typically the port of New York or Norfolk, the sight of the Manhattan skyline was a traumatic revelation. While German cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin were being systematically reduced to rubble by the RAF and the USAAF, New York stood untouched, its skyscrapers aglow with electricity, its harbors teeming with an activity that spoke of infinite resources. For a soldier who had spent years in a world of blackouts, rationing, and ruins, the illuminated Great White Way was a visual testament to the absolute failure of the German strategic air and naval campaigns. Once processed at the ports of entry, the prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport to camps scattered across the American interior, often in states like Texas, Kansas, or Mississippi. These rail journeys provided the most sustained and devastating evidence of America's industrial might. German soldiers, accustomed to the relatively compact geography of Europe, were stunned by the sheer vastness of the American continent. They traveled for days on end, passing through thousands of miles of farmland, industrial hubs, and thriving cities, all of which were completely free from the scars of war. The realization that they could travel for 3,000 miles without seeing a single bomb crater or a burned-out building was a heavy blow to their morale. They saw endless miles of freight trains carrying tanks, planes, and millions of tons of supplies heading toward the coasts, supplies that they knew were destined to be used against their comrades back in Europe. The sheer throughput of the American rail system, which moved more tonnage in a week than the entire Reichsbahn could manage in a month, demonstrated a level of kinetic energy that the German military could not hope to match. The agricultural productivity of the United States was another source of profound shock. In Germany, by 1944, the civilian and military food supply was precarious, and the agricultural sector still relied heavily on animal power and manual labor. As the POWs looked out the windows of their transport trains, they saw a landscape that was almost entirely mechanized. They observed thousands of tractors, combine harvesters, and specialized machinery working the fields of the Midwest. The realization that America could feed its own massive population, provide for its millions of soldiers abroad, and still have enough surplus to feed its prisoners of war better than the average German soldier was fed on the front lines was a crushing insight. The POWs were frequently served meals that included white bread, fresh meat, butter, sugar, and oranges, items that had become luxury goods or disappeared entirely in the Reich. The famous anecdote of a German officer seeing a bowl of fresh oranges or a soldier being served sliced white bread and realizing that the war is lost was not a myth but a common lived experience among the prisoners. If a nation could afford to give its enemies such high-quality rations, its capacity to supply its own troops must be limitless. This logistical superiority extended to the very infrastructure of the POW camps themselves. Most German prisoners were housed in facilities that, while secure, provided a standard of living that often exceeded what they had known in the military or even in civilian life back home. The camps were equipped with modern plumbing, electricity, and recreational facilities. The fact that the Americans could build hundreds of such camps, each capable of housing thousands of men, almost overnight and thousands of miles from the front lines, was a logistical marvel. The German military, which struggled to maintain supply lines over a few hundred miles in Russia, was faced with an opponent that could effortlessly manage a global supply chain spanning 2 oceans. The presence of consumer goods in the camp canteens, items like Coca-Cola, chocolate, and American cigarettes, further emphasized the disparity in industrial capacity. The POWs saw that while Germany was stripping the brass from its doorknobs and the bells from its churches to make shells, the Americans were producing an endless stream of consumer comforts alongside their war materiel. The psychological impact of American wastage was also a recurring theme in the accounts of German POWs. They observed American soldiers and civilians treating resources with a casualness that bordered on the offensive to the disciplined German mind. They saw jeeps left idling, half-eaten meals discarded, and massive amounts of construction materials used for minor projects. What the Germans initially interpreted as a lack of discipline, they eventually realized was a sign of overwhelming abundance. The Americans did not need to conserve because their factories and fields were producing more than they could ever use. This economy of excess was a weapon in itself, a demonstration of an industrial reserve that could absorb any loss and still maintain a crushing momentum. The contrast between this and the total war economy of Germany, where every scrap of metal and every drop of fuel was rationed with obsessive care, made the hopelessness of the German position undeniable. Labor programs for the POWs further reinforced these impressions. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, many prisoners were put to work in American agriculture and non-war-related industries. This allowed them to see the American industrial machine from the inside. They worked in canning factories, on massive irrigation projects, and in specialized agricultural operations. They saw the quality of American tools and the efficiency of American labor management. They also interacted with American civilians, including women and older men, who were performing complex technical tasks with a proficiency that shattered the German myth of decadent American society. The sight of women operating heavy machinery or managing large farms while the men were at the front proved that the American home front was as mobilized and disciplined as any in Europe, but with a vastly superior resource base. The ideological dismantling was perhaps the most lasting effect. The German soldier had been taught that the New Order in Europe was the peak of human organization. In the United States, they found a different kind of order, one based on a chaotic, high-energy, and technologically driven democracy that seemed to work with a frightening efficiency. The lack of visible police presence, the freedom of movement within the civilian population, and the general atmosphere of optimism and plenty stood in stark contrast to the fear and austerity of the Nazi state. Many prisoners began to question the Endsieg, final victory, they had been promised. If the Americans possessed this much land, this much food, and this much machinery, how could a small, resource-poor nation like Germany ever hope to prevail? The Überman myth could not survive the reality of the American assembly line. Furthermore, the treatment of the prisoners themselves was a form of psychological warfare. By treating the Germans with a level of professionalism and abundance that they did not expect, the Americans undermined the fight to the death mentality that the Nazi leadership tried to instill. When prisoners were shown films of the liberation of concentration camps or the destruction of German cities later in the war, the evidence of their own eyes regarding American strength made these reports more believable. They knew the Americans weren't lying about their industrial capacity, so they were more likely to believe the reports of German atrocities and military failures. The cognitive dissonance of being a prisoner in a land of plenty while their families were starving in a land of ruins led to a profound sense of betrayal by their own leadership. The legacy of this shock can be seen in the post-war period. Many German POWs returned to their homeland with a deep respect for American industrial and organizational methods, which played a role in the eventual economic miracle of West Germany. They had seen the future in the factories of the Midwest and the ports of the East Coast, and they understood that the world had been changed forever by the American arsenal of democracy. The shock of 1943 and 1944 was not just a military defeat, it was a realization that the era of European hegemony had ended, replaced by the overwhelming, mechanized, and industrial weight of the United States. The German POWs who arrived in America were the first to truly understand that the Third Reich had not just lost a war, it had collided with a civilization that operated on a scale it could not even begin to comprehend. The sheer volume of motor vehicles in the United States was another point of astonishment. In Germany, even during the peak of the war, the military was heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport. The average infantry division used thousands of horses for its logistical needs. In America, the POWs saw that everyone, from the farmer to the factory worker, seemed to own a car. They saw the motorized nature of American life as a direct extension of the country's military power. They understood that the same factories producing these civilian cars were the ones churning out the Jeeps, the deuce-and-a-half trucks, and the tanks that were overwhelming the German lines. The automotive culture of the United States was the engine of its victory, providing a level of mobility and logistical flexibility that the German army, despite its early successes with panzer divisions, could never truly match across its entire force structure. The quality of American clothing and equipment also left a lasting impression. The POWs were often issued American surplus or work clothes that were of higher quality than their own uniforms. They noticed the durability of the fabrics, the precision of the stitching, and the practical design of the gear. This attention to detail in mass-produced items was a hallmark of American industrial philosophy, the ability to maintain high standards of quality even at enormous scales of production. For the German prisoner, every well-made boot or sturdy jacket was a reminder that the enemy was not just more numerous, but was equipped with a superior level of industrial craftsmanship that was accessible to the common soldier. Moreover, the psychological effect of the American dream as a tangible reality began to take root in the minds of some prisoners. They saw a society where immigrants from all over Europe, including Germany, had found success and integration. They saw German-American communities where the language was still spoken and traditions maintained, yet these people were clearly and proudly American. This blurred the lines of the racial struggle that Nazi ideology had promoted. The realization that Germans could thrive in a democratic, pluralistic America suggested that the necessity of the Nazi expansionist war was a lie. The industrial might they witnessed was not just a product of resources, but of a social system that could mobilize the talents of a diverse population toward a single, overwhelming goal. As the war progressed and more prisoners arrived from the Western Front after D-Day, the stories they brought with them of the Allied wall of fire, the endless artillery barrages and the constant presence of Allied aircraft, were confirmed by what they saw in America. They understood that the Jabos, fighter bombers, that had made movement impossible in France were the product of a manufacturing system that thought nothing of producing 100,000 aircraft in a year. The shock and awe they had experienced on the battlefield was given its context in the humming factories of the United States. The connection between the production line and the front line was made visceral. A prisoner working in a fruit orchard in Utah could look up and see a flight of B-17s or B-24s being ferried toward the coast and know exactly where they were going and what they were capable of doing. This awareness led to a phenomenon where many German POWs became Americanized in their outlook long before the war ended. They adopted American slang, developed a taste for American food, and began to follow American sports and news. This was not merely a survival strategy but a genuine response to the vibrancy and power of the culture they were immersed in. The shock of arrival had evolved into a reluctant, and then often enthusiastic, admiration for the American model of productivity and organization. By the time they were repatriated after the war, many of these men were the most effective ambassadors for the American way of life, having seen the arsenal of democracy at its source and having realized that its power was rooted in something far more substantial than the propaganda of their youth. The experience of the German POWs in the United States remains one of the most compelling examples of the clash of systems during the mid-20th century. It proves that the most effective form of persuasion is often the undeniable evidence of physical reality. The industrial might of America, as witnessed by its enemies, was the ultimate argument against the ideologies of the Axis. The guard on the wrong coast in Normandy, the snipers in the ruins of the East, and the medics in the field were the hands of the Allied effort, but the factories of Detroit, the mills of Pittsburgh, and the farms of the Midwest were its heart. The German POWs were the unintended witnesses to this heart's strength, and their shock remains a testament to the time when the United States transformed itself into a global power that could turn the tide of history through the sheer weight of its productivity and the resilience of its spirit. The arrival of German prisoners also forced a confrontation with the reality of American social dynamics. While the Nazi regime had portrayed the United States as a land of racial chaos, the POWs observed a country that, despite its deep-seated flaws and the reality of segregation in the South, was capable of a high degree of social cohesion for a common cause. They saw people from all walks of life working together in the war effort. The efficiency of the American woman in the workforce, in particular, was something that many German men found difficult to reconcile with their traditional views, but they could not deny the results. The industrial output was proof enough. The total mobilization of the American people, achieved without the overt state terror used in Germany, was a revelation of the power of a voluntary and motivated populace. In the final analysis, the shock of the new, experienced by these men was a critical component of the post-war reconstruction of the German identity. Those who had seen America knew that the future would be built on different principles than those of the past. They had seen that a nation could be both a military powerhouse and a land of plenty, and that industrial might was most effective when it was used to support a society that valued the individual as much as the collective. The story of the German POWs in the United States is more than a footnote of the war. It is a prologue to the modern era, a moment where the old world met the new and was forever changed by the encounter. The industrial might they witnessed was the foundation of the world they would return to, a world where the American century had truly begun, built on the steel, the wheat, and the unshakable resolve that had so shocked them during their time in the arsenal of democracy. The logistical feat of the POW program itself, transporting nearly 425,000 German prisoners across an ocean and housing them in over 500 camps, was a secondary but powerful demonstration of American capability. The administrative efficiency required to track, feed, clothe, and provide medical care for such a large population, while simultaneously fighting a two-front war, was something the German military bureaucracy found staggering. This administrative might was the invisible twin of the industrial might. It meant that every American action was backed by a system that worked, a system that didn't break down under pressure, and a system that could project its will across thousands of miles with mathematical precision. This was the final, and perhaps most daunting, realization for the German prisoners. They were not just fighting an army, they were fighting a system that had mastered the modern world. As the years have passed, the accounts of these prisoners have become a vital part of our understanding of the home front. They provide an outside perspective on the American miracle of 1941 to 1945, a perspective of awe and, ultimately, of transformation. The German POWs who arrived in the United States were the last to see the old America before it became a global superpower, and they were the first to understand what that change would mean for the rest of the world. Their shock was the first ripple of a wave that would eventually sweep across the globe, defining the history of the 20th century and beyond. The Texas farmer, who destroyed 258 tanks, the medics who turned survival rates upside down, and the snipers in the ruins were the front edge of this wave, but the source was always the vast, humming, and unstoppable industrial heartland that the prisoners first saw through the windows of their transport trains. The transition from a state of total war to a state of total incarceration in a land of plenty created a unique psychological condition for many POWs. They found themselves in a gilded cage, where the physical conditions were excellent, but the existential realization of their country's defeat was ever present. This led to a high degree of cooperation within the camps, as many prisoners decided that their best hope for the future was to learn as much as they could from their captors. Some studied English, others took correspondence courses from American universities, and many learned new trades. This intellectual mobilization within the POW population was a direct result of the respect they had developed for American efficiency. They wanted to understand the secret of America's success, and for many, that secret lay in the integration of industrial power with personal liberty. When the news of Germany's unconditional surrender finally reached the camps in May 1945, many of the prisoners were not surprised. They had known the war was lost from the moment they had seen the lights of New York or the endless wheat fields of Kansas. The industrial might they had witnessed was too vast to be defeated by any ideology or any military tradition. The surrender was merely the formal acknowledgement of a reality they had been living with for months or even years. As they prepared to return to a Germany that was unrecognizable, shattered, divided, and occupied, they carried with them the memory of the American heartland as a blueprint for what their own country might one day become. The shock of the industrial might had become a seed of hope for a new beginning. In the long run, the POW experience in America was a bridge between two eras. It transformed hundreds of thousands of German men from soldiers of a totalitarian regime into citizens of a new, democratic Germany. Their exposure to the arsenal of democracy was a form of education that no textbook could provide. They had seen the power of a free society to mobilize its resources and the effectiveness of a modern industrial economy to project that power across the globe. The legacy of their shock is the stable, prosperous, and democratic Germany of today, a country that learned from its defeat and from the example of its most powerful captor. The industrial might that once terrified them became the standard they strove to emulate, a final and enduring victory for the art of survival and the art of deception that had defined the war. The specific details of the prisoners' observations often centered on the mundane aspects of American life that revealed the most about its industrial depth. They were fascinated by the availability of consumer electronics, the quality of civilian automobiles, and even the complexity of American kitchen appliances. To a German who had been told that American industry was a veneer over a crumbling society, the sight of a middle-class American home was a revelation of deep-seated economic strength. They realized that the military-industrial complex was not a separate entity but was built upon a massive and healthy civilian economy. This dual-use nature of American industry, the ability to pivot from making washing machines to making tank components, was the true genius of the system. Furthermore, the POWs observed the American approach to human capital. They saw that the American military and industry placed a high value on the initiative of the individual. In the camps, they saw American guards and administrators who were given a high degree of autonomy to solve problems. In the fields and factories where they worked, they saw workers who were encouraged to suggest improvements to the process. This contrasted sharply with the rigid, top-down hierarchy of the German system. The industrial might they saw was not just a product of machines, but of a way of thinking that empowered people to be more productive. This was perhaps the most difficult shock for the disciplined Germans to process, the realization that liberty was actually a source of industrial efficiency. The historical record of the POW camps in America is filled with stories of this cultural and industrial exchange. There were music groups, theater troupes, and sports leagues organized by the prisoners, often with the support of their American captors. This soft power of the American experience, backed by the hard power of the industrial output, created a total environment that reshaped the German psyche. The prisoners were not just being held, they were being processed by the American reality. The shock they felt upon arrival was the first step in a journey that would take them from the darkness of the 20th century's worst ideology into the light of a new, globalized world. As the last of the POWs were repatriated in 1946 and 1947, they left behind a country that had been permanently changed by their presence. Many Americans had developed a more nuanced view of the German people through their interactions with the prisoners, and many prisoners had developed a lifelong affection for the United States. This human connection, forged in the context of an overwhelming industrial disparity, was one of the most important foundations of the post-war alliance. The Texas farmer and the German POW had met on common ground, and the result was a mutual understanding that would help rebuild the world. The industrial might of America had won the war, but it was the humanity and the efficiency of the American system that won the peace in the minds of its former enemies. The final image of the German POW in America is one of a man standing at the railing of a ship, looking back at the skyline of New York as he heads home. He is no longer the soldier of the Thousand-Year Reich. He is a man who has seen the true scale of the world and the true power of an industrial democracy. He carries with him the memory of the lights, the trains, the food, and the machinery. He knows that the world he is returning to is broken, but he also knows that it can be rebuilt because he has seen what is possible when a nation's industry is guided by its people's will. The shock of American might was the end of his war, but it was the beginning of his future. Would you like me to analyze the specific impact of German POW labor on the American agricultural economy during the war years, or perhaps look into the re-education programs that were implemented in the camps toward the end of the conflict?